Jeffrey Epstein was one of the most powerful men in the world. Billionaires, politicians, royalty, and even celebrities all seemed to orbit around him. But after decades of accusations, investigators finally arrested him, and for the first time, it looked like he actually might stand for trial. Then, just over a month later, he was dead. Within hours, the public was told exactly what happened, but almost immediately, that story started to fall apart. Guards that should have been watching him never made their required rounds, and surveillance footage from an earlier incident was mysteriously unusable. When forensic experts took a look at his neck, shocking findings were discovered, and nobody agreed with the official outcome. So, were these just oversights, or did the medical evidence point towards something much darker? Today we're going to put aside the conspiracy theories and do what we always do on this channel. We're going to walk through the autopsy findings, the prison failures, and the forensic evidence step by step to see what the science actually tells us. And once you understand how the body should have responded, this case somehow becomes even darker. Welcome to the True Crime Nurse, everybody. My name is Kat, and I'm a registered nurse who loves all things nursing and true crime. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell before you go. Today, we're going to be focusing on the death of Jeffrey Epstein from the nursing perspective, especially the autopsy and all of the crazy circumstances that surround his death. I will touch on his life and crimes just a little bit for some context, but the goal of today's video is to focus on the details surrounding his death. All right, let's get started. Jeffrey Epstein was born on January 20th, 1953 in Brooklyn, New York, in a working class family. His father worked for the New York City Parks Department, and even though he had a humble upbringing, Epstein was very intelligent, especially when it came to math from a very young age, if only he used that intelligence for good. After attending Lafayette High School, he ended up at New York University's Courant Institute of Mathematical Sciences. Now, he never completed his degree, but that didn't prevent him from landing a job that actually required one. In 1974, he began teaching calculus and physics at the prestigious Dalton School in Manhattan, and this is where he began forming the personal and business connections that he did, and these shaped the rest of his career and life. One of those relationships was with a Bear Stearns executive named Alan Greenberg. The two of them met because Epstein tutored his son. Greenberg helped to secure him a position at Bear Stearns in 1976, where Epstein quickly rose through the ranks, and he ended up becoming a limited partner by 1980. He was fired from that job in 1981 for misconduct, which the details about that firing seem to be pretty hush-hush, but by then, he'd already built a network of wealthy and influential contacts that allowed him to transition into the world of private finance. That's when the big money and resources really started to roll in. Now, the details of Epstein's financial empire have always been somewhat of a mystery. He claimed to manage money exclusively for billionaires, then he would charge clients a percentage of their profits instead of their assets. His relationships with people like billionaire Leslie Wexner, who was the founder of L Brands, became a huge contributor to Epstein's wealth. Wexner actually gave total control over his finances to the point that he eventually transferred ownership of his 9-story Manhattan townhouse to him. This is a property that I'm sure that you recognize if you followed along with the Epstein investigation, because it became central to the criminal investigation against him. Despite years of scrutiny, though, no one has been able to fully explain how Epstein accumulated his massive fortune. His investment firm, J. Epstein & Co., had almost no public profile, and investigators said that the financial structure of it was unusually secretive. What was undeniable, though, was the lifestyle that it funded. He had multiple luxury estates, a private Boeing 727, and Little St. James Island, aka Epstein Island, which is the private island that he purchased in the U.S. Virgin Islands in 1998. We also know that Epstein surrounded himself with some of the world's most powerful people, including politicians, royalties, celebrities, scientists, and prominent business leaders. Flight logs from his private jet documented travel by numerous high-profile figures, too. Even though those individuals have described their relationship with Epstein as totally innocent, and they all say that being in a flight log doesn't mean that they participated in any criminal misconduct, the records still show us the elite circles that he was moving in, and I can't help but wonder why. What did Epstein have that was so enticing to the elites if they all allegedly never participated in anything that he was convicted of? Behind that carefully cultivated image was a long-running system of harming young women and girls. According to victim testimony, civil lawsuits, and federal investigative records, Epstein recruited girls, many of them being between the ages of 13 and 17, who often came from vulnerable backgrounds, especially when it came to finances. They were initially offered money for massages that turned into far worse, And then some of the victims were then pressured to recruit other girls. This created a network that operated from Epstein's homes in Palm Beach, Manhattan, New Mexico, Paris, and Little St. James, all with the help of his partner, Ghislaine Maxwell. For a thorough deep dive into the horrifying crimes that this monster committed, I highly recommend Stephanie Harlow's series into him, especially because today we're just going to be touching on them in this video. The first criminal investigation into Jeffrey Epstein was in 2005 after the parents of a 14-year-old girl reported Epstein to the police in Palm Beach. Everyone, including the police, were well aware of what he was up to, but he was too deeply connected to ever get caught. Detectives spent about 2 years building a case against him, and they ended up recommending multiple felony charges. But instead, in 2007, U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta negotiated a very controversial agreement with Epstein's legal team. His team included several of the country's most prominent attorneys, and the deal also granted immunity to any potential co-conspirators. If that isn't a red flag, I don't know what is. The victims weren't even notified that this was happening beforehand. In that deal, Epstein pleaded guilty to 2 state offenses involving intimate work, one of which involved a minor. He received an 18-month jail sentence for that, but he was granted work release privileges that allowed him to leave jail for most of the day, 6 days a week. He basically just slept there. He only served 13 months, and then he was released back to his previous lifestyle as if nothing ever happened. And do we think he learned anything from this experience? No, certainly not. This agreement was one of the most lenient offers ever seen in a case of this magnitude. But years later, federal courts ruled the prosecutors had violated the Crime Victims' Rights Act by failing to inform the victims before coming to that agreement. Investigative reports done by journalist Julie K. Brown in 2018 exposed that plea agreement and how it was negotiated, and that the victims had been excluded from the process. This is actually what led to federal prosecutors in New York reopening the investigation, which led to Epstein's second arrest. That wraps up our background recap and brings us to what we're here to talk about today. On July 6, 2019, federal agents arrested Jeffrey Epstein once again after his private jet landed in New Jersey. He was transported to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, where he was charged with trafficking of minors and conspiracy to commit trafficking. This time, Epstein faced up to 44 years in federal prison, which is basically a life sentence because he was 66 years old at that time. A federal judge denied Epstein bail because he posed a significant flight risk with his extreme wealth, connections, and access to private aircraft. So he remained in federal custody awaiting trial, and nobody could anticipate what was coming next. Epstein arrived at the Metropolitan Correctional Center on July 6, 2019, which was the same day that he was arrested. The MCC is a 10-story federal jail in Lower Manhattan, and it was operated by the Federal Bureau of Prisons. It is not by any means a minimum security facility. This building needed to be secure enough to protect defendants that are awaiting federal trial, including organized crime figures, cartel leaders, and violent criminals that require a higher level of security. When Epstein got there, though, it was understaffed, overcrowded, and it had many documented failures that the Bureau of Prisons was well aware of for several years at that point. Epstein was placed in the Special Housing Unit, or the SHU, which is where high-profile or at-risk inmates are housed. Now, remember, his crimes were against young girls. We all know that prison justice is a very real thing. So one of the most hated men in the entire world being in a secure cell that was heavily monitored made sense. Shortly after his arrival, he was placed on a closer watch just to make sure that he didn't hurt himself, and this is standard protocol when there's a reason to believe that a prisoner may be at risk for harming themselves. On watch, an inmate is typically placed in a cell with no sheet, no cord, and no sharp objects, and they're checked about every 15 minutes at minimum. In fact, they're usually checked more often than that. Guards are required to physically lay eyes on them to make sure that they're okay, plus there are cameras, and this is a federally mandated process. On July 23, 2019, so 17 days after he got there, Epstein was found on the floor by his cellmate, Nicholas Tartaglione. Tartaglione was a former New York police officer awaiting trial on 4 counts of murder in connection with a drug-related quadruple homicide in upstate New York. The details of what happened that evening are heavily debated, though. Tartaglione's attorney said that their client found Epstein with marks on his neck and that he called for help immediately, and that Epstein was unresponsive or semi-responsive at the time. MCC staff initially responded, and they felt that this was a possible attempt at Epstein taking his own life. But When Epstein became more alert, according to a source cited by multiple outlets at the time, he had been attacked, and it was actually Tartaglione that had attacked him. Of course, Tartaglione's attorney denied this, and they maintained that their client actually saved Epstein's life. But on the flip side, Epstein had a major target on his back, and he himself said that he was attacked. We will never know the truth about what happened between those two men in that cell on July 23rd, though. What is documented is that medical staff treated visible injuries on Epstein's neck, and oddly enough, that surveillance footage from outside of their cell had been corrupted and couldn't be reviewed. I'm sure that many of you watching have seen and heard about this in the media, especially with all the pressure surrounding the files being released too. But the corruption of this recording was allegedly due to a technical issue. Sure, technical issues happen all the time, but it's also possible to understand why, for many people, that this didn't look like it was one. Even though these injuries were documented by medical staff, this incident was still seen as a possible attempt at taking his own life. He knew that he was facing charges that would likely lead to life in prison, and that this trial would potentially expose some of the most powerful people in the world. But despite all of this, the decision was made to take him off of watch. So that meant that Epstein would be moved to a lower security area right after he almost died. Let me know your thoughts on that. The decision to remove him from watch was made by a psychological staff member at the MCC. Under BOP protocol, Epstein had a psychological assessment, but the clinical note explaining why that decision was made has never been fully released, and I personally find that strange. After he was removed from watch on July 29, 2019, Epstein was moved to a different cell in SHU, which was cell 1L23 on the 9 South tier. He was assigned a new cellmate shortly after that. The 9 South tier area of the special housing unit was supposed to be staffed by 3 officers on every shift, but on the night of August 9th, there were only 2. The cellmate that had just been assigned to Epstein's cell was transferred back out on the evening of August 9th, 2019, which is the night before Epstein would be found dead. This is documented and confirmed in what records have been released. Now let's talk a little bit about the guards. Epstein's new cell was located on a tier that required inmates to be checked every 30 minutes instead of every 15 minutes where he was before per BOP protocol. Every 30 minutes, a CO was required to physically walk past that cell and document the check. On the night of August 9th into the early morning of August 10th, the 2 officers assigned to the 9 South tier were Officer Tova Noel and Officer Michael Thomas. According to the Department of Justice indictment filed against them, Noel and Thomas did not make their required rounds that night. Instead, they slept for hours, and Thomas spent time shopping online for furniture and motorcycles, and then they both falsified the logs showing that they had made their rounds every 30 minutes as required. The surveillance footage told a different story, though, and here is where the surveillance evidence becomes critical. The CCTV footage from the SHU corridor outside of Epstein's cell confirmed that neither of the guards made the required checks during the critical time window. The guards lied. Then, at approximately 6:30 a.m. on August 10, 2019, the guards finally conducted a check of cell 1L23, and what they found, they were not prepared for. Cell 1L23 is a very small space at roughly 9 feet by 12 feet, which are the standard dimensions for a federal SHU cell. Inside, there is a concrete bunk with a thin mattress, a toilet sink combo unit, and a small desk or shelf that's bolted to the wall. The room had almost no horizontal surfaces above head height, except for the upper bunk and certain structural fixtures. This is all laid out strategically for safety reasons. When the COs arrived at his cell, though, they found Jeffrey Epstein unresponsive. He was in a near-seated position, hanging from the top bunk. MCC staff called a medical emergency immediately, and emergency services were dispatched. Once they arrived, they cut him down and administered aid. Epstein was quickly transported to New York Presbyterian Lower Manhattan Hospital, which is about 10 minutes from MCC by ambulance, and there was already paparazzi there waiting. This seemed so strange to so many people because in such a short window, how did paparazzi know that he was even coming? The medics were actively performing CPR en route, but Jeffrey Epstein was pronounced dead at the hospital at approximately 7:36 that morning. On that same morning, the Attorney General and President Trump were both informed about what happened, and by the afternoon, the news broke that Jeffrey Epstein was dead. And even though it was all over the news that Epstein did this to himself, nobody online believed it, and we're going to talk about why that is, backed by facts and not rumors. I know that many of you here in our community are here specifically for cases like this, where we deep dive into the autopsy, and get ready. because this is complicated, and the complications here are very important to talk about. The New York City office of the chief medical examiner took custody of the body, and the autopsy was performed on August 11th, 2019, so the day after Epstein's death. This was performed by Dr. Kristen Roman, who's a medical examiner for New York City. Dr. Barbara Sampson was the chief medical examiner, and she did not perform the autopsy herself. However, she did review the findings after them as the chief. Right away, Dr. Roman did not classify the death as self-inflicted. She listed the death as pending, and a few days later, Dr. Sampson, the chief, said she reviewed additional evidence and then changed the ruling to self-inflicted by hanging. She has never revealed what that additional evidence even was, but a clip on 60 Minutes suggested that the incident between Epstein and his cellmate in July, the one where the cameras stopped working, may have been why. It's also important to remember that when Epstein recovered from that, he clearly stated that he had been attacked. So, as you can see, from the very beginning, we already have reason to proceed with caution here. Because of the controversy surrounding this case from the beginning, Jeffrey Epstein's brother, Mark Epstein, hired a third expert to be present for the autopsy, and that was Dr. Michael Baden. He is a former New York City chief medical examiner himself, and he had decades of forensic pathology experience with over 20,000 autopsies performed in his 45-year career. He witnessed the autopsy firsthand and reviewed the photos, and he had some interesting insights that I'm going to weave in as we go over everything. Let's start with the hyoid bone, though, because this is the centerpiece of the entire forensic debate here. The hyoid is a small horseshoe-shaped bone that sits right at the front of the neck, at the level of the third cervical vertebra between the chin and thyroid cartilage. It's suspended by muscle and soft tissue, and its purpose is to anchor the tongue and support the larynx. The hyoid fractures differently depending on how death occurs. In a self-inflicted hanging where a person suspends their own body weight, the force will run upward and towards the back of the neck. In this case, the hyoid bone tends not to fracture, especially in younger individuals whose bones are more flexible. Some of this is going to be a review for any of our regulars here, but in strangulation cases where an external force is applied to the neck, typically with hands, forearms, or a ligature pulled horizontally, the hyoid fractures far more frequently because the force is direct and lateral rather than suspended and upward. In Jeffrey Epstein's autopsy, the hyoid bone was fractured, specifically the left side of the hyoid bone, and that is not the only fracture that was found. The autopsy photos that were described by Dr. Baden actually showed documented fractures of both the left and right thyroid cartilage too. That is 3 separate fractures in the neck: the left hyoid bone, the left thyroid cartilage, and the right thyroid cartilage. Now, does a fractured hyoid automatically mean that a victim was strangled by somebody else? No, it doesn't. Hyoid fractures can occur in hanging cases, especially in older individuals whose bones are a little bit more brittle, and Jeffrey Epstein was 66 years old. But here's the most important thing to take away from this. A fractured hyoid bone in a hanging case is uncommon enough that it should require a deeper investigation to rule out homicide. And when you factor in 3 separate neck fractures, that picture becomes so much more than concerning. Dr. Baden said, "I have never seen 3 fractures like this happen in a self-inflicted hanging." Then he said something even more important. He reviewed over 1,000 other jail hangings in New York City and state prisons over the previous 40 to 50 years, and not one of them had 3 fractures. That is an alarming statistic. What he saw on that autopsy table did not match what he'd ever seen before in a case that was self-inflicted, which speaks volumes. Dr. Sampson stood firmly behind her findings, though. She said that fractures of the hyoid and cartilage can be seen in either scenario, and she also said that you can't draw a conclusion from one finding, and that everything about this case had to be considered. We have more to talk about here, but I want to know what your thoughts are thus far. In addition to the fractures, the autopsy also documented ligature marks on Epstein's neck, and the pattern of them needs to be paid attention to as well. In a self-inflicted hanging, those marks typically run upward at an angle toward the suspension point in an inverted V pattern that's created by the body's weight pulling down while the ligature pulls up. In ligature strangulation or homicide, that pressure is applied from behind or at the sides, and those marks tend to be horizontal and wrap around. Epstein's neck showed horizontal ligature marks, and they were low, running straight across the middle section of his neck. This pattern strongly suggests homicide statistically. Something that can help to support this pattern, though, is body positioning. Unfortunately, Dr. Baden confirmed that nobody took photos of the position of Epstein's body when it was found. The only pictures we have are of the aftermath, which also makes it difficult to know with certainty whether or not he could have done this to himself. According to Dr. Baden and the forensic pathologist that 60 Minutes consulted, knowing the body's position would have clarified important findings like the precise location of the ligature mark on his neck, injuries found post-mortem, and the way lividity settled after death. Dr. Baden said, quote, "At this length of time, we still don't have that information. So if this was called self-inflicted without all the additional information, it was a premature judgment," end quote. That is a former chief medical examiner saying that a foundational piece of evidence, like where the body was, how it was positioned, and what the scene looked like prior to being disturbed, doesn't exist, and a ruling was made anyway. I do want to add that regardless of all that information, in my opinion, that points clearly in one direction, the guards probably panicked and called for backup prior to even thinking about documenting photos. Also, remember, he was brought to the hospital, so the nurse in me wants to believe that not taking photos wasn't nefarious or intentional on their part. Their negligence in not rounding certainly was, though. Some other important findings that were found on Epstein's body were contusions or bruises on both wrists, an abrasion on his left forearm, and most importantly, deep muscle hemorrhaging in his left shoulder muscle. There was also an injury to the back of his neck and a cut on his lip, plus a needle mark in his arm. That likely came from the IV and resuscitation attempts at the hospital, though. But the wrist bruise and the left shoulder muscle hemorrhaging requires some more digging. Deep muscle hemorrhaging in the shoulder is not a finding that would ever come from a hanging. This is more consistent with a restraint, a struggle, or someone gripping or bending that arm. The wrist contusions are concerning for the same reasons. Could they have come from being pressed up against a hard surface during an incomplete hanging? Possibly. Are they also consistent with someone's wrist being grabbed and restrained? Also, yes. Neither finding is conclusive. But when you piece together everything, like the 3 neck fractures, absent guards, horizontal neck marks, and more, all signs are really pointing in one clear direction. Dr. Baden seems to be the only one that saw that out of all 3 experts, though. When it comes to the actual tool that was used, the ligature in cell 1L23 was reportedly made from an orange fabric, possibly a bedsheet or a uniform, and it was attached to the upper bunk. The upper bunk in a standard federal SHU cell is not at all the height that would allow a body to fully suspend in the air. The position of the ligature would have required Epstein to actually lean forward from a kneeling or seated position, also known as an incomplete hanging, or positional asphyxia by hanging. Now, complete suspension hangings, where the body is fully lifted off the ground, produces a fast and consistent pattern of injuries because the full weight of the body is creating the compressive force on the neck structures. In incomplete hangings, where the feet remain on the floor or the body is partially supported, it's a little different. This position requires that the individual maintains the position or to lose consciousness before reflex movements would naturally interrupt the process. Incomplete hangings absolutely can and do cause death, even though they're more commonly seen in accidents, but the critical question in Epstein's case is whether the injuries documented in the autopsy are consistent with the physics of an incomplete hanging based on the described position, especially because we don't have photos. Seeing multiple fractures in an incomplete hanging where the body is partially supported by their own weight is a very unusual injury pattern. The compressive forces in an incomplete hanging are typically lower, which would suggest less, not more bony trauma. So, the fact that the injuries that Epstein sustained are significant on both sides of his neck are not consistent with the way that he was found. Despite everything that we just talked about, Dr. Sampson and her chief medical examiner determined that Jeffrey Epstein did this to himself. This ruling still stands today, but the forensic debate and the reason for disagreement are legitimate and grounded in real science, not conspiracy. Dr. Baden supported all of his stances with statistics and facts, and I hate to say it, but the rebuttals from the 2 MEs involved through the state did not. Now, when it comes to the crime scene itself, while the cell was secured, documented, and processed after his body was discovered, investigators could never really reconstruct exactly what happened during the several hours when guards failed to perform their required checks. This leaves so much room for imaginations to run wild, with both theories that very well could have happened and some more creative ones. Investigators found no signs of a violent struggle inside of the cell, like blood or anything else that seemed suspicious. They did find those injuries on Epstein, though, that we went over, that may have come from someone attacking him. DNA recovered from the bedsheet ligature was consistent with Epstein's own DNA, and many people believe that this finding alone supports the fact that no one else was involved. But let me know if you feel that that one point is strong enough. Forensic experts have said that the absence of an obvious struggle does not completely rule out another person, though, because someone could have been in there without leaving any kind of evidence behind, especially without guards around and sketchy camera footage. One issue that has drawn attention, though, involves the ligature itself. Crime scene photos show more than one noose made from the orange fabric in the cell, two to be exact. The one noose that was collected as evidence appeared to have been intact and had folded ends rather than being cut, even though the reports state that the first responders cut Epstein down before they started CPR. This raised serious questions about whether or not the correct ligature was even preserved, but we haven't seen anything in the media come from this. If photos were taken after he was cut down, then it doesn't make sense that the fabric was still intact and folded on the edges, though. The two correctional officers that were responsible for monitoring Epstein, Officers Tova Noel and Michael Thomas, were charged in late 2019 with falsifying prison records after they allegedly documented the checks that they never performed. They both pleaded not guilty because they said that they were working in an understaffed, dysfunctional prison. Federal prosecutors eventually dropped the charges in 2021, and neither officer was convicted of anything. A lengthy 2023 report by the DOJ Inspector General showed countless failures at the prison, including severe understaffing, falsified records, broken equipment, and repeated violations of safety procedures. The report confirmed that required inmate checks were not done, and they also questioned the decision to remove Epstein off of watch right before he died. As far as where things currently stand from a legal perspective, though, Jeffrey Epstein's death in 2019 ended the criminal case against him, but it did not end the legal proceedings that surround his crimes or the files that still haven't been fully released. In many ways, his death made all of this even more complicated, and the public is still outraged over this, rightfully so. Civil lawsuits have continued on even after Epstein's death, and his estate created a compensation program that has paid hundreds of millions of dollars to its survivors. Some of them accepted settlements, while others chose to continue pursuing lawsuits. So many questions still remain about Epstein's death, and no one's ever been charged in connection with it other than Ghislaine Maxwell. Epstein's brother, Mark Epstein, has continued to challenge the ruling and has called for an independent investigation, but no official findings have ever been changed. Because there were no eyewitnesses, no usable camera footage from inside the cell area, and numerous documented failures within the prison itself, it may never be possible to know exactly what happened that night. The prison where Epstein died, Metropolitan Correctional Center, was permanently shut down in 2021 after years of documented issues and major security problems. Ultimately, the unresolved debate over Epstein's death should not overshadow the most important part of all of this, though, and that's the dozens of girls and young women that were harmed over the course of many years by him. His death prevented survivors from seeing him face trial and answer to those allegations in court. The survivors will never fully get the justice that they deserve. I personally know what it's like to face the person that harmed me in court in this exact manner, and even though some of those wounds will never fully heal or go away, it did give me a small sense of peace as a little girl, and it truly breaks my heart that his victims will never get that, regardless of how this monster died. So, while the circumstances of his death continue to be debated, by myself included, the documented harm, the institutional failures that allowed it to continue for years, and the experiences of the survivors remain the most important part of this story. Thank you so much for spending time with me today. I look forward to seeing what your thoughts are about today's video, and you're gonna have to let me know if you learned anything new or what your stance is in the comments. Now, I know that this topic can be very polarizing and touchy, but I love when we have the hard conversations in the comments. Make sure to do something that makes you smile today, nurse's orders, and drop our secret handshake, the butterfly, in the chat if you made it to this point in the video. I'll see you next time.